So S3 is a simple storage service, and that's why its name is S3. So simple storage service means it is a service which allows us to store objects into cloud. So S3 was one of the few first services that AWS has launched, and it is pretty famous. It has some security concerns as well, so you have to be aware of that. So we are going to cover this as part of our, uh, this course for S3. We are going to look into buckets, objects, how the cost is allocated for S3, which is pretty important, and there would be a couple of questions related to it. We are going to look into the object lifecycle policies, and as I've probably mentioned it before as well, there would be a specific question for this where you will be given a policy, and then based on that you have to answer. We are going to talk about replication, security, and then some best practices. So this topic uh, we are going to cover today. We are going to do most of the hands-on part because I want to cover this when rest of the class is available, so that they have also have a bit of understanding. So today we will focus on more on the hands-on part, and by probably next class I will have the presentation fixed as well. So anyways, uh, S3 is basically, as I mentioned, a simple storage service. So what happens, I will just share my screen. Let me first clean this up. So first, else I will end up paying a lot of. Okay, let me just delete it. Once it is deleted, I can delete the transit. So if you go to S3, ah, so they've changed it to scalable, but it was simple storage service. Now, if you search S3, it says scalable storage in the cloud, the simple storage service. Okay, so the important concept, you have to create a bucket. So bucket is kind of a folder or directory, but there are certain rules for naming buckets, right? And we are going to look into it. The bucket name should be unique with the global namespace. And this means if somebody has, for example, if I try to create AWS bucket, right? So until unless this is unique, I will not get that you can say bucket name. So why this is so? Because you can actually host websites on these buckets. So that's why it's very useful. You can host your complete website on S3 bucket, and it would be very cheap. So this is, for example, let me just create AWS Bootcamp bucket. All right. So I've selected a name, AWS Bootcamp bucket, and in case when I try to create, if somebody has already created a bucket with AWS Bootcamp bucket, then I won't be able to create it. Then just like ACLs are basically access control list. We are going to look into detail when we talk about S3 security, but think of it, you can actually enable or disable who is going to, write or read onto the bucket. Now this is pretty important because what you can do, one of the architecture is that when you can share an S3 bucket for someone to upload files as well. So somebody can, upload to the S3 buckets so that you can also provide object writer permission. So object writer means somebody can write to your S3 bucket. So as of now, let me just keep it disabled. We can change it later as well. Then there is the public access. Public access means all the files from this bucket are available publicly. Anyone can download it, right? So by default, you should keep it disabled. Then bucket versioning. We are going to talk about what versioning is, and then tags. And then you see there is a encryption option. First is the server side encryption with Amazon S3 managed keys. Basically, the keys that would be used to encrypt these buckets are managed by AWS, so you don't have to do anything. The second option is by AWS KMS keys. KMS is a service, key management service, that is provided by AWS, or dual layer server side encryption with AMS, key management service. We'll keep it default SAC S3. right? And then bucket key you can disable, right? This means you will create a separate key for this bucket rather than using the default one. You will have some advanced settings. Object lock. If you enable the object lock, this means you can only delete once you add MFA to your account, right? So just disable it, else you won't be able to delete the content from your bucket. So these are the options. Any question from on these options for S3 bucket? What are the options for S3 buckets? If no question, I will click on create bucket, and this bucket is created. So I have all these buckets. So I'll go to the AWS Bootcamp bucket. Now you can see there is an option to upload. Before we go there and upload the content, I will show you properties. So if I go to properties, this bucket is in which region? AP South 1. Now S3 as a service, if I go to S3, this S3 service is in its nature a global service, but your buckets are tied to a region. So if I click on buckets, I can see where my buckets are located, right? And then you have these access points. Basically you can create an access point so that your S3 uh, buckets are available from these access points. Let's come to this AWS camp bucket. Now if you come to this part, this is pretty important. Amazon resource name, or ARN. So ARN, every resource that we create in Amazon will have an ARN. Okay. So how this is generated? Basically, it's just like IPv6 address. It is separated by colon, and here it is ARN colon AWS colon S3. So this is a type of S3 service, and then these are default, which is basically not filled in as in, and then there is the bucket name. So these default one will have your account name, region name, etc. But because this is the ARN for this S3 bucket, you can actually copy it and use it in IAM policies, etc. So once we talk about IAM policies, you would use a lot, this ARN concept. It has a creation date, right? Now, if I change the bucket versioning, basically I'm enabling a concept of versioning where you are having object versions stored. So we are going to talk about it. We have an option for tags, and I'm going to talk about tags a lot in the cost part. We have the encryption enabled. The next thing is intelligent tiering archive configuration. So intelligent tiering is one of the concept which is pretty important for S3 bucket. What I wanted to show you here is all these options, requester pays, static website hosting, transfer acceleration, object lock, and event bridge. So these are the options which you can use with S3 in properties. Okay. If you go to permissions, you will have block public access settings, which we already switched on, and then a bucket policy. So we are going to practice a bit of bucket policy uh, where we write a policy for this bucket. And then you have the object ownership and access control list. All right. Matrix will tell you what is the size of bucket and how many objects we have. So if I go to any other bucket, for example, let me go to so in this bucket, I have, you can see around 48 MB stored data and around 499 is the count of the data. And this is with respect to time. So I can see 1 day, 1 week, or 2 weeks. So it will show me this data, what is the size of the bucket and what is the total number of objects. Okay. And then last is management, where you can configure lifecycle rules. So this is a lifecycle rule that I've configured. This is for the other bucket, 100 days for a course that I created. Yeah, that's it. So if I come to my essay bucket, I will try to upload something. So let me just upload here. I'll click upload, and as you can see, you can add files or folder, and this would be the destination, target destination. So let me just add a file, and from my system, for example, I will go to, I will upload this document, NFV white paper, right? And here, you don't need to change anything. Storage class is basically a concept that works with S3. So right now I'm not going to change anything. I will just upload it and then close it. So it has succeeded. So the file is here. Okay. If I click on this file, it will tell me the properties of the file. So it has hashed the owner information, and then there is the S3 URI. And if you can see, this is S3 and direct colon AWS Bootcamp bucket NFV white paper. So I can actually download, you can say, my file from this URL if I'm inside the AWS environment and there is sufficient permission for any of the resource to access S3. All right. Then there is the ARN for this file, which is AWS Bootcamp was the ARN for my bucket plus the NFV white paper, or you can say the name of the file, when it was last modified, and what is the E tag. So this E tag is important, and when we talk about versioning, you should know about this E tag. Okay. So, and then there is a storage class. Any questions till now? How we create S3 bucket and how we upload files to S3 bucket. Okay, so let's start. Sorry for that. Couldn't find this. So one of the concept is cross-region replication. So cross-region replication means suppose you have very critical data that you want to replicate into different regions. So what you can do is you can use something called a cross-region replication. So for this, you need to set up a target bucket. For example, right now you have a source bucket in Mumbai. You can set up a target bucket in Sydney, and with this cross-region replication, whenever you have this, you can say, data uploaded to source bucket, it would be copied to the target bucket. Now there is a problem in it. The problem is that you are going to pay inter-region cost. Okay. So as I mentioned before, previously as well, that you pay in case of AWS, for the cost inside AWS, the biggest cost is inter-region transfer. So you are just going to pay inter-region transfer. That is the additional cost, and the cost for maintaining this data in this bucket. So if you have 1 GB of data in source bucket, you will have total data 2 GB, 1 GB in source bucket, 1 GB in target bucket, and then you're also going to pay for the inter-region data transfer. Okay. For this cross-region replication, you need to have versioning enabled. Versioning enabled on both the buckets. You cannot enable cross-region replication until unless you have versioning enabled on both the buckets. Now, if you talk about versioning, what is versioning? So let me just come to that part. Yeah. So basically, versioning means just like in in your Word, etc. If you are creating a document, you probably would save a different document in a different version so that you know what edits or what changes you have done. So with versioning, what happens? If you overwrite a file, right, and if you don't have versioning enabled, you would lose that original copy. Or if you delete the file. So in both cases, if you delete or if you overwrite the file, you will lose the original file. But with versioning enabled, what would happen if you overwrite the file? It will create another copy of it, file text version X, and the original one would be stored with a different version ID or ETAG ID. Right? So this is important to understand. If you have versioning enabled, it will have two, you can say, copies of the same file, and it will put a pointer to the current version. So there would be a pointer to the current version. So which we are going to see as an experiment as well. So versioning is required for any, as a best practice for any production based S3 bucket. you should put versioning there, so that in case there is an accidental delete, you are able to recover those files from S3 bucket. And as I mentioned, this is a kind of prerequisite for cross-region replication. Cross-region replication, as name suggests, is just copying of the files from one source bucket in one region to another bucket in that region. All right. We need to talk about transfer execution later. Let's come to the next one. Yeah. How does delete work in versioning? So suppose you want to delete the file. You deleted the file. What would happen? S3 will not delete the actual file. What it will do, it will just put a delete marker. So this file will be hidden, but it will not be actually deleted from S3. So this delete marker would be present, and if you remove this delete marker, you can restore the file. So just to remove the you can say file, you need to remove the delete marker. Okay. So this is the benefit of using versioning in S3. Any question related to versioning or cross-region replication in S3? All right, let's come to the next concept.
So while deleting, should we go with the latest version or we can delete new one?
So it's up to you. In case, for example, let me just go to this bucket. And in properties, I can go to bucket versioning and edit it. And I will enable it. Okay. So this bucket versioning is enabled in this one. Now, if I upload the file, for example, I just add where is so I just copy it. I will create a new text file and I will name it as, let me just rename it as one locally, and I will just rename it as so I created a blank file, text file, which is of 0 bytes, and I uploaded it with the same name, right? So what has happened, it's showing me the file of 0 bytes. But if I select it, go to the properties, sorry. So if I click on it, you will see the version here, and this is the current version, and this is the previous version. And you can see the size as well. Now let me just try to delete this file. So I will click it and I will delete the file. And I will type delete here and then delete it. So as soon as I delete it, it's hidden from here. But if I click on show versions, you will see you have all these files here, right? The first one is the file name and it has a delete marker. So as soon as I remove this delete marker, it will ask you to copy it. So I've removed the delete marker. So I can see I have, if I just remove the show versions, this file available. So as soon as you remove the delete marker, which is the version restored, the latest one. All right. Now if I remove this one, if I just click on show versions, and if I remove this one, you see I have this, you can say file restored, which is of original 862 kilobytes. So in case you want to delete any version of the file, you need to click on show versions and then specifically remove that version of the file. Okay. And also you can remove the delete marker if you want. Any questions in this versioning concept? Okay. So the next, so in S3, you should be doing at least 3 to 4 labs. And the most important one, yeah, Bhargav, go ahead.
Can we rename the version ID?
Rename the version ID. So let's try that. I haven't done any renaming for versioning. Let me just upload this again. So if I click on show versions, and if I, no, I don't think so. You can rename anything. So the only actions
Okay.
available is delete, right?
Okay.
All right. So as I was talking about, what are the type of labs that you probably should practice is basically upload is simple, but what is versioning and then cross-region replication and transfer acceleration, and then one of the key part is hosting a static website. So by default, keep this in mind. You will at least have one question on static website in on S3. It's a very important concept. And then lifecycle policy in S3, you will have at least one question. So let's talk about lifecycle policies. For example, if I go to this bucket, I think it was, okay. So let me just open which S3 bucket I had configured. Anyways, let me show you here. So I think these two buckets have cross-region replication on, but let me show you how to do it. So what I'm going to do now is in the management, I'm going to set a lifecycle rule. So you have to create a lifecycle rule. Now, before we go into that, let's go to the S3 storage class. So as I mentioned, I will just create all this and I will share it with you. But there is a Amazon S3 storage class. Okay. And these are the storage classes. Think of it, what are the options available for S3? So if you click on this infographic, right, this is very easy to understand. This one, okay. Uh, I will just zoom it and I'll explain you with this. So if you come to this one, the general is standard, okay, standard storage. So you pay, for example, X amount for standard storage. Then there is another one, infrequent access. Infrequent access means you are going to store it for a longer time. You are telling AWS, okay, I don't want them frequently. So what happens with storage, when we are using storage, there are two things, okay. When we think of storage, think of this is your any storage in your data center. There are two aspects of getting data from the storage. One is actually storing the data. So this is storing of data. And the another option is actually retrieving that data. To retrieve this data, you will have some sort of compute, right? To fetch the files from your storage, you need to use some sort of compute. you need to use network. And with this, also, for storing data, you are using disk here. So there is some effort in retrieving this data. So what happens, the default one is AWS S3 standard. Standard means you are paying a fixed price, right? Then second option is S3 standard infrequent access, IA. Infrequent access means you are telling, okay, AWS, I'm going to store this data, but I'm not going to, get it too frequently. So what would happen? They would give you some discount on storing data, but they will increase the cost in retrieving data. Because anyways, if you are not accessing this frequently, this partial increase won't impact you that much. All right. So this is the second option. Third option is one zone infrequent access. So by default, this S3 is in a bucket this bucket is tied to a region, right? Now this bucket is in region and by default is multi-AZ. So one of the AZ goes down, still your S3 data is accessible. Third option is S3 one zone IA. So you are also telling AWS in this one, okay, I don't want this data frequently. Also, I don't care if the availability zone goes down. So I'm happy with storing it in one zone only. This means your reliability of data is reduced. That is, it is available less frequently. So we are going to talk about where it is useful, but one zone IO means you are storing data in a specific AZ, and it doesn't you don't care whether it's always available, and you don't care in case an AZ goes down. You won't actually need this data in that scenario. Then you have Glacier storage. Okay, so we are going to talk about Glacier now. So Glacier is archiving. So generally what happens, if as the data gets older, the chances of retrieving it also reduces. So if we want to, create a kind of graph and we say freshness of data, and then you can say retrieval probability. So if it would be something like this. So the fresher the data, the retrieving probability would be higher. But as the data get older, you're not going to retrieve it so frequently, right? And this is mostly for any type of data that we use in enterprise, which is actually, if I say freshness of data, suppose you have a data which is always in use. For example, your employee records, right? Your employee records is continuously being updated there, here and there. But suppose you took a backup of your employee records maybe 5 years back. What is the chances of retrieving that of 5 years back data? It would be reduced, right? So everything depends on freshness of data, and it is where your lifecycle policy comes into picture. So you can store, as I mentioned, freshness of data. This means we are going to retrieve our data. This you can say, sorry, this part we are going to retrieve it much more frequently, and this we can go and archive it, right? If the data is not fresh, we can archive it. So generally, the industry best practice, and there might be some compliance about it as well, is basically if we have data less than 6 months, we can move it to a low access probability tier. Everything older than 2 years to 5 years, depending upon what industry you are and what are the compliance requirement, you can archive them, right? So what happens? We create a life cycle policy. So this life cycle policy means from the adding of the data in S3 bucket, think of this data is getting, as this data gets older, we are moving, transitioning into different storage type. So let's say this is storage type 1, we are going to storage type 2, storage type 3, and then we are going to archive it. All right. And what we are using, what type of service we are using it for archiving? It is called Glacier. Now Glacier has some options, which is basically, if you see this, so you have Glacier as archiving option. And if I show you Glacier instant retrieval, flexible retrieval, and deep archive. So we call it GIA, and then flexible retrieval, sorry, GIR, GFR, and the last is Glacier deep archive. All right. Any questions related to the concept of data lifecycle, data archiving, and what are the type of storage classes? So I will give you a table, with the following. Yeah, this is the table actually, which I wanted to, let me just show you here. So this is the complete details of the table, and it actually mentions what is the use case and what is the availability. So if you see the availability, if I show you S3 Express 1 zone or 1 zone IA, the availability has reduced from 4 nines to 3 nines. Okay, and here it's 99.5 for which one? 1 zone IA. So this means it has a very reduced availability. So you're not going to definitely store your critical data in this. Where you are going to store, where you are going to use 1 zone IA, for example, you have images that you want to process and as a background job. So you can use for any type of data that requires background jobs, you can use 1 zone IA. And then there is the minimum storage duration. So if you store anything on this storage class, which is standard 1 IA, so suppose you uploaded a file, right? You need to at least keep it for 30 days. For Glacier, it is 90 days. Okay. So these are the kind of storage duration and you can say policies. Now keep in mind, when we talk about lifecycle policies, we can always go forward. We cannot go back. I mean, you cannot move a file from Glacier to you can say S3-1A or S3-1 zone IA. Once you retrieve the file, it will go to AWS standard for usage, but then you need to, you cannot go back. Okay. So let's try to create a lifecycle rule. So let me call it as a test lifecycle rule. So I can apply to all. Now there are some actions, for example, permanently delete non-current objects versions of the object, which means suppose you have versioning enabled, but as time grows, what happens to the older version? So you can delete it. For example, after 90 days, you can delete, maybe I want to only retain one version, but you can delete rest of the versions of that file in case there are versions created. Then you can expire current versions of the object, which means basically after maybe 1 year, you delete that object altogether. Expire means you delete that object. Then you have delete expired object or delete markers on incomplete multi-part upload. This is essential. For example, suppose you have versioning enabled and you have delete enabled, delete marker. So what you can do is you can specify how many days after you can delete it. So let me just remove this one first. And then delete expired object delete markers. Basically, if you have deleted you can say objects, it is going to delete it. Now then you have move current versions of object between storage classes. This is the lifecycle policy that I was talking about, transitioning between objects. So here you can select, for example, I want to archive it. So I want to move to Glacier instant retrieval after maybe 1 year. All right. And after 1 year, maybe after 720 days, I will move to Glacier Deep Archive. Now, as my first transition was into Glacier Instant Retrieval, you see the second option does not, second you can say dropdown does not give me previous options. So this means I can only move forward from Glacier Instant Retrieval. I can only go to Flexible Retrieval or Glacier Deep Archive. All right. So it means after 1 year, my file will go to Glacier Instant Retrieval, and after almost 2 years, it will go to Glacier Deep Archive. All right. So it says there would be some cost. I will acknowledge and I will explain all the costs that is related to it. And yes, you can just create the rules. It will give you a good graph of what are the rules created. So in one of the question, you might get kind of this policy here. This is the current you can say version actions, or this is the current lifecycle policy. What would happen to the object? Okay, so this is how you create a lifecycle rule. Any question in this one?